that you have everything you need to share your screen in just a moment here. And to start off our program today, I'd like to welcome everyone, thank our audience for being here for our Tales from the Deep Insights from OceanWise research program, so formerly known as our Ask an Expert series, but now we're really embracing this as our very own program and wanting to share lots of great stories and information with you, so we've rebranded it under that name. If you enjoy the program, if you have comments for us, if you want to share it with your friends, please feel free to hashtag OceanWise Research in any of your posts. Now, to begin today's program, I'd like to share how grateful I am to be here actually on site at the Vancouver Aquarium today. It's a little bit dark out in the galleries. We've been conserving a lot of power, so I'm here in one of our classrooms, which with a nice sunny north-facing window, and that is on the traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. And since time immemorial, they have been incorporating storytelling and observation into their practice and everything they do. And we love to learn and use that, build it into our programs, as it's such a wonderful example of science and citizen science, all the way now to present day. And so we're so grateful to be teaching and learning and living on their traditional lands. And we're really excited to be learning all about tracking microplastics. And so as we now have a great audience ready to learn, I will turn the floor over to you. Feel free to introduce yourself, welcome our friends here online, and tell us a little bit about your work.
Thank you. I'm going to take a second to set up my screen. All right. Yes, you're seeing my screen now? Wonderful. So hello, everyone. I'm really happy to speak with all of you today. Well, first of all, my name is Shreyas. I am with the OceanWise Plastics Lab. And I would like to share with you some of the work that the Plastics Lab does, the kinds of problems and challenges that we are interested in studying and tracking, and the strategies and techniques that we use to address those challenges. And I imagine you have access to the chat box, so if you have any questions in between, feel free to post something in the chat box and we'll do our best to get to them. Okay, so I guess to set the stage a little bit, sorry, yeah, hopefully this should work. So to set the stage a little bit, we know from estimates that plastics are entering the world's oceans at the rate of approximately 1 truckload per minute all day, every day, all over the world. If, like me, you have spent any time in the developing world, images like this one would be quite familiar to you. But as it turns out, the problem and the challenge of plastic pollution is actually a lot more insidious than what you would seem, what it would seem by looking at a picture like this one. Oops. And the reason for that is microplastics. What happens is when the plastic products that we are all familiar with enter the environment and are exposed to the elements, they break down into microplastics. That's just a technical term for plastic pieces that are smaller than about 5 millimeters in size. In addition, sometimes microplastics like these are also manufactured intentionally. Examples of that would be certain cosmetic products that contain microbeads, certain industrial nurdles that are manufactured for specific applications, and so on. Microplastics like these have been found in all parts of the ocean worldwide, and have also been seen in species going all the way from tiny plankton to enormous whales. As you may imagine, when microplastics enter the waterways, they typically do so near where people are, near cities, urban settlements, industrial sources, agriculture, and so on. But once they enter the waterways, as you see in this chart here, they are subject to the same conditions that all parts of the ocean are, that exist everywhere in the ocean. So those include temperature changes, strong currents that exist at different parts and depths of the ocean that can push these particles around. All of which is to say that even though you may expect microplastics to enter waterways near urban environments or wherever people are, they don't necessarily stay there, and they move around within the ocean. Which brings us, excuse me, to the notion of the great oceanic garbage patches. You may be familiar from reporting in the media about the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, which is a term used to describe region of the Central Pacific Ocean, which has a lot of plastic pollution accumulation. The reason these exist is because of gyres in the ocean currents. Plastic pollutants get pushed around the oceans until they accumulate in these certain regions that have gyres in them all around the world. The most famous of them is in the Central Pacific, the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. A recent research study actually showed that these garbage patches that we have known about for a little while are actually only a small part of the problem. You see, the currents on the surface that they exist on the surface push around plastics that are floating in the ocean till they accumulate in these garbage patches. But the same thing is happening deep underwater at the ocean floor and in the sediments for plastics that sink down to the ocean floor. So we have a much bigger problem than the one that I just described happening underneath the ocean, deep underwater in the sediment level. So you have analogs of these gyres forming deep underwater and leading to accumulation of microplastics there as well. So what the Plastics Lab does is we study entry points, urban transfers, destinations, and effects of microplastics at all these places in the environment. And we focus on research and studying interventions, targeted interventions that may address some of these crises. Targeted interventions would look like examples being targeting specific consumer practices or certain industrial practices to see if that makes a difference. Aspects of urban regulations or municipal engineering, and keeping in mind practices of risk assessment and having thresholds for certain regions of the environment that are vulnerable. I wanted to give you a brief overview of some select stories or projects that we have worked on recently, just to give you a sense of the kinds of things that can be done. So these are just illustrations of the kind of work that we do. On the left here, you see my colleague Matthew at a specially built laundry research facility. And the reason we use this is, as you may know, many textile fabrics that we use in our day-to-day life are made of synthetic polymers, polyesters, nylon, and so on. But I guess you can imagine that these fabrics release microplastics, in particular microfibers, into the environment, and most particularly when they're in a laundry machine. And this is our project to study the impact of the impact that these fabrics have in terms of the microfiber pollutants that they release when they are in a laundry. Here you see my colleague Stephanie at a local wastewater treatment facility. The purpose of having wastewater treatment facilities like this one is that they accumulate urban wastewater from major cities and make it and process it so that it's safer before it's released out into the ocean. And what we are doing is we collect samples from this water at different stages of the treatment process so that we have a sense for how, for the incidence of plastic pollution at different stages and how effective various stages are as the water goes through the processing. And finally, on the right, I don't know if you can tell from the label on this bag here, but this is a sample of a beluga whale poop collected from up in the Arctic. We have a research project to study the impact of microplastic pollutants in various species in the Arctic. And what this image here shows is this is a microplastic piece of polystyrene that was collected from beluga whale feces. So that's just an illustration of the level of incidence of plastic pollutants you have even in the Arctic. So what we do to understand this problem is use a broad set of tools that I'm using a collective term forensics to describe a number of different practices. So briefly, what it involves is in the way I just described, we target specific environments and collect samples that we suspect might have microplastics. We then clean these samples and let them go through several digestion processes so that it makes it easier to study them. We then use several different types of technology and observation processes to study them, and I'll get into the details of that in a little bit. And finally, we use techniques from statistics and data analysis to draw conclusions from what we see in these environments. So I guess the first step would be when we get a sample to study from an environment like the ones that I described. You can imagine that because these are microplastics, the things that we are looking for are not easy to see. So we look at them under a microscope. When a researcher looks at a sample like this under a microscope, they are able to sometimes tell by looking at the sample based on things like color, shape, how shiny the sample is, that's called the luster. Based on these properties, sometimes you're able to pick out microplastics, and then you can pick them out and collect them and sort them so that you can draw conclusions and conduct analyses. But sometimes this process is actually hard. It's especially hard when these plastics have been exposed to the elements and they've been in sunlight or have been underwater for a long period of time. Or you can imagine they're covered in some kind of slime or biofilm of some sort, which makes it difficult for a researcher to distinguish between a microplastic particle and something that could just be a mineral or a naturally occurring particle of some kind. So to make that distinction, we need more precise analytical techniques. And the analogy I would like to use to describe that is like in criminal forensics, people can be uniquely, well, somewhat uniquely identified based on their fingerprints. Microplastic forensics uses fingerprints, quote unquote, of materials to uniquely identify them. This is possible because all materials have a unique property that can be measured by something called infrared spectroscopy. And I want to dwell on this a little bit and give you some more details on how this works. But to do that, we'll have to go on a detour in quantum physics, which happens to be my specialty. So I'm very happy to do that and I hope you all will bear with me. So like all matter, plastics are made up of atoms and molecules. Specifically, in the case of plastics, these are enormous chains of carbon molecules that make up long molecules called polymers. Now, the rules of quantum physics tell you that these molecules are allowed to vibrate or oscillate in different ways, but they can only do that at specific fixed energies called quanta of energies. And this amount of energy is strongly dependent on the precise arrangement of the atoms in that molecule or the detailed chemistry. And so this is the property that we make use of in infrared spectroscopy. So what we do is we shine infrared light on the material that we are studying and carefully note what colors of light are being absorbed by that material. So at the plastics lab, we use a device called an FTIR, that stands for Fourier Transform Infrared Spectroscopy, which allows us to very conveniently measure these infrared fingerprints of the materials. I'm not going to get into the details of how this device works, but I would love to talk about it. So if you have questions, we can chat for a long time about that later. But the point here is, in this machine, we can measure these curves that look like this. So what the machine is doing is it's measuring the amount of infrared light that's absorbed by the material as a function of the color of the infrared light. So at some point, at some colors, the material is absorbing very little. At others, it's absorbing a lot. And this curve is very different for every different material. I'm showing here examples of two common polymers, polyethylene and polypropylene, and just showing how different they appear. The other advantage we have from this is that standard databases exist that contain infrared spectra of hundreds of thousands of materials. And so it's possible to take a new material and do like a cross-referencing to identify this material by comparisons. So I wanted to walk you through this process a little bit to show how this would work in practice. So imagine you're out in the field and you pick up two pieces of microfiber that you think are pollutants, so microplastic pollutants, but you don't know for sure. All you know is that you've picked up two environmental microfibers. One of them looks bluish, one of them looks pinkish, but you don't know anything more than that. You suspect they are microplastics. So the first thing to do is, after taking them through the cleaning and processing steps, is to give them to the FTIR machine and ask to see what the spectrum looks like. So that's something we can do. And this is, I'm showing you the spectra that were obtained for these particular fibers. So we have a measurement of what the absorption spectrum for these fibers look like. Now, these are two very different curves. They look entirely different from each other. So already, I guess we can say that these are likely very different materials. We don't know what they are, but they are likely very different. But I guess the real useful step is the next one, where we have an algorithm take the spectrum and essentially run a search engine across a library of existing spectra and use that to identify. So you take the spectrum and voila. For the first material, the algorithm looked at the library and found this black curve, which it knows is polyester. And so by looking at this, we can say with a high degree of confidence that this blue fiber is a polyester. Similarly, for this spectrum, the algorithm found a library spectrum that looks like this. it knows it's cotton, and so we can say with a high degree of confidence that this is a cotton fiber. We know that we can also get some bonus information. So there's a question about what more information we can get, and I'll get to the question in a bit. But there is a lot more information that we can get from infrared spectroscopy. One example of that is, just as I described, it can be readily used to identify what material we are looking at. So I guess this, as this illustration shows you, we are looking at a number of spectra for nylon, and it's very obvious that it's nylon that we are looking at. But the additional information that we have is because of the fact that there's a difference in nylon if you just pick a piece of nylon off the shelf versus if it's been submerged underwater in the ocean for months or a year. And even though visually maybe you can't tell the difference, because their spectra are so different, this is a bonus information that we get immediately from infrared spectroscopy. There's a distinction that we know what kind of material it is, but we can also say a little bit about what kind of environment it has been exposed to. The direction where some of the science is moving is towards large-scale data collection and sharing globally, so that people who are making decisions have a big picture view of the state of the ocean worldwide by looking at all of the combined data. And a lot of this is possible because of advances in current data science and machine learning that make it possible to make libraries of microplastic pollution. What algorithms are able to do now are pick out and identify and classify microplastics down to sizes of a few microns, so tiny, tiny microplastics. And this picture here is a sense of the state of the art. What you're seeing is a computer program that has taken an image of a sample from somewhere in the environment and the algorithm scanned through the image and picked out different microplastics, what kind of environments they have been exposed to, what they are, what is the chemistry of them, and their sizes and shapes and so on. So maybe this answers one of the questions that was asked about can you just identify it, or can you also combine it and get an estimate of the quantity? So in a system like this, it is possible for these measurements to do both. But I wanted to, so we have all of this technology and we are doing all of these measurements, but I wanted to leave you with a sense of why do this and why this is important. And the reason is, well, you can look at this photograph here. This is a member of a species of zooplankton that's collected from in the Arctic. It's about 2 millimeters in length. It's about as wide as my little finger. And we found a tiny piece of microfiber within this zooplankton. The reason this is important is because zooplankton are a key species in the Arctic. They, in some sense, indicate the health of the entire ecosystem. So it is very concerning that if we find a microfiber in a species like this, it says something alarming about the state of the entire ecosystem. This is the plastics lab team that is responsible for the research that I showed you. As you can imagine, we have been working from home for the past several weeks, but we are starting to get back in the lab to collect data once again. And this research is made possible by our many partners in industry and organizations, as well as federal and local government agencies. It would not be possible without their support. So that's where I wanted to leave you. I'm very happy to take any questions and talk about any specific parts or details that you're interested in. So please let me know.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Actually, one question I'm quite curious about was that Jose asked, is nylon 66 biodegradable? That it's one of the most common textiles. Do you know?
I'm not 100% confident, but I believe it's not. Nylons are some of these long polymer compounds. Now, you have to be quite careful when you talk about biodegradable, because everything is biodegradable if you wait long enough. But in the sense for it to be useful, there's a specific classification of what biodegradable means, and that's I don't believe nylon falls under that.
We have another question that just came in. What technology is currently available that could remove or destroy these microplastics? And Daphne was actually also asking kind of how long does it take them to break down typically?
Both of them are really good questions. For removing, it's essentially, I would say that the state of the technology is you can't do it. If you have microplastics dispersed in ocean, out in the open ocean, it's essentially cost prohibitive to do anything meaningful in terms of removing them. So to fight this crisis, the easiest way is to stop them at the source. So that's where a lot of our targeted research comes in, is to understand where we can stop these things from getting in the first place, because it's really hard to get them out once they get in. For breakdown, that I really like that question, because it gives you a sense for what timescales are involved. So when we think of something that you would understand as being biodegradable, cotton, for example, cotton and wool are biodegradable. If you leave them out in the ocean, in a few months, they disappear entirely. So the cellulose molecules that make them up are broken down into much simpler, smaller molecules in a matter of months in the ocean. If you have some of the what are marketed as biodegradable compounds, the details are very complicated, but if they're exposed to an elevated temperature, or if they're in the presence of certain special bacteria, they're able to break them down into smaller compounds, smaller, less harmful compounds, and release them in the environment. So that's possible, but depends on the temperature and chemistry and so on. But if you just have a plain old polyethylene, or an old-fashioned plastic compound, it'll stay as a long polymer that's harmful to the environment for, I believe it's like in the order of millions of years. So it takes something around millions of years for it to break down to non-harmful compounds. So I guess the answer is complicated, but yeah, so it depends on exactly what you're talking about.
So kind of the source and, again, the environment, has many impacts on it. Wonderful. Getting lots of great questions about what are some of the most common fibers and kind of where are they found? What sort of things do you find in the Arctic through the beluga, poop research, as well as just kind of what are common fibers that you're seeing in all the work that you're doing?
Polyester is one of the most commonly occurring from what I'm remembering from the data that I've seen. So polyester is a class of compounds, but those are the most commonly used in consumer plastic products. Nylons are commonly used, but there's some indication that they are less likely to give out microfibers. So even though they exist in the consumer world, the incidence in ocean samples is dominated by polyesters. But you can find several examples. one of the more interesting observations was that cotton and wool, which I just described as being, good because they biodegrade very easily, but because there's so much more of them, what we have found is if you take a random sample, you actually will still see quite a fair amount of cotton and wool. And the reason is, even though they go away very quickly, there's a lot of them coming in. So I guess you can have, the answer to the question would be, it's a mix. You get a mix of different type of fibers that are found in the environment.
Wonderful. And I think you kind of actually started to answer this question too as it was coming in. Kind of what are some of the common sources of these fibers, and is there anything that we can do to try and reduce how much microplastic is getting into the waterways?
There are several. One where our research has been focused is on microfibers that are released into the environment from laundry. And that's where we have found that it depends quite a bit. The amount of microfibers being released depends quite a bit on the construction of the textile, whether it's knit or spun or woven. I guess one of the most effective interventions that we have found is using a lint filter. So like you have lint filters in dryers, you can have the same kind of addition in a laundry washing machine as well. And those are quite effective at picking out microfibers. So these lint filters pick up the microfibers in the laundry machine before they go to the wastewater treatment facilities. So even though we have these wastewater treatment facilities, they are not 100% effective. So the more you can do to lower the load on the wastewater treatment facilities, the better it is.
Wonderful. It definitely sounds like everyone's individual actions really kind of helps overall with that positive impact. So that's great to hear. Hopefully our audience is feeling kind of inspired to make those little changes.
Well, I guess the one small thing I would add also to that is, so the microfibers coming through laundry is one thing that we have focused on, but there's known existing research on one of the biggest sources of plastic pollution being single-use plastic. So this is one area we are focused on, but the existing knowledge is on, single-use food containers, the usual disposable plastic products that we use. And I know that some of the actions and research around that has changed in the past couple of months because many of the practices, at least in places like Vancouver, have changed around from people not using, or for me personally, not using single-use plastics at all ever to having to, you have to use single-use plastic because stores wouldn't allow you otherwise. So that's another major issue, which is very complicated, but it's seen all the time in the environment.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We have lots of great questions coming in. I'm so thrilled with our audience today. One of the questions was also kind of what quantity of microplastics sink versus kind of float? Like how do they interact in freshwater versus saltwater?
I don't know that much about freshwater. The recent research that I mentioned earlier shows that it's actually a lot more that are sinking than, so the ones that float are easier for us to notice and study, and that's why I guess they are much more covered in media, but it's a much bigger problem with respect to the ones that are on the ocean floor. And in a sense, you can think of out of sight, out of mind, but that's what they are at. It's a much bigger fraction, maybe even like an order of magnitude bigger fraction that's sunken at the ocean floor versus the ones that are just floating up there.
And then we're getting lots of questions. I love the Ocean-Wise audience is always thinking of our animals. So we've had questions like, do animals eat these plastics, and what are some other impacts that plastics have on animals in the ocean?
Yes, this is, I'll preface this by saying that, first of all, it's not my area of expertise, but second of all, it is an area of active study. So this is the precise impact of plastics on what are called biota, which is different living organisms, is a very active area of study. We don't know for certain what effect microplastics have once they are in different organisms, but they have been seen ingested by plankton, like I showed, various fish, salmon, so these are trophic levels of different species. So you see them in plankton, in salmon, in whales. So it goes all the way across, and there are some results to indicate that they harm the gut health or various health aspects of all of these marine species.
And then we also have some questions around kind of, again, what can we do to take action? But, these plastic bans that we often keep hearing about, what kind of effects do they have on microplastics in the ocean?
That's a really good question as well. It's, again, the answer is complicated, I guess. That's how I would say. In the big picture, I would say yes, plastic bans are effective and useful, but policymakers, when designing these plastic policies, need to be really careful, because there is some evidence on sometimes if it's not done properly, it can be counterproductive. So the people who are making this policy need to be aware of the consumer habits and the culture and the prevalent industries in their constituency before making it. So in some jurisdictions and some regions, plastic ban makes sense, but then you have to be careful that you're not having unintended consequences of that. So I think the places, so for example, Vancouver and British Columbia are moving in the direction of a plastic ban. And I think in this environment, it can work really well if it's done well. So I think as a policy goal, it's good and we should do it, but we have to be careful about unintended consequences.
Very good advice. I always tend to go to the everything in moderation. So hopefully decisions are being made very well informed. So I completely agree. Again, just a reminder to our audience, we still have a few more minutes of the program, so we'd love to see a few more of your questions coming in.
I guess I saw that there's a follow-up to what do I mean when I say unintended consequence of a plastic ban? I guess one example would be, I want to say this data I saw was in California, but don't quote me on that. You can look this up. But the data was super interesting in that in this jurisdiction, they banned single-use plastic bans and enforced everyone to, or forced everyone to use cloth or reusable bags. The problem is if this doesn't result in a mindset change, individuals or customers would, instead of buying a plastic bag every time at the checkout, if they don't remember to bring their own reusable bag, they would end up buying a new cloth bag every time. And that, it turns out, has a way higher environmental footprint. So if you're, instead of buying a plastic bag, instead of buying 10 plastics bag, if you buy 10 cloth bags, it's actually much worse, because producing a single cloth bag has much worse environmental consequences than a single plastic bag. The intended consumer behavior is that instead of buying 10 plastic bags, you buy one cloth bag, keep it at home, and take it with you to the store every time. So that was the intended outcome, but the unintended outcome ended up being that the people are buying 10 times as many cloth bags and resulting in much worse impacts on the environment. So that's, I guess, one example of what can happen if you're not careful about this.
Excellent. Yeah, that's definitely a great example. I sometimes feel like that's with collections of reusable coffee mugs at the same as well.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Um, we also, I know that you were saying again, it's much better to try and stop these microplastics from entering the water because they're quite difficult to remove. One of the questions that came in was, are there any efforts to try and collect the garbage either from these giant Pacific garbage patches or other kind of collections of them in the ocean?
Right. People are there. There are research projects that are looking into this using creative technologies, but as of right now, it's just not. Uh, you know, the cost structure just doesn't work out. It's like trying to collect carbon dioxide from the air once it's been released. It is possible. People are working on solutions for that, but it's much easier. At this point, the best thing we can do is stop things at the source.
Absolutely. And then we have lots of questions about kind of the benefits of biodegradable plastics. And is there anything that we should be aware of or cautious of when it comes to those?
I love that question. Thank you for whoever put it in. I would caution, when it comes to biodegradable plastics, the issue around policy is a bit fluid right now. Governments and local municipalities are still figuring this out. The thing to be careful about is if a product or a label says that such and such is biodegradable, what does that mean? Because like I said earlier, everything is biodegradable if you wait a few million years. What we want is for it to be biodegradable in a useful way. And that depends on the kind of local composting infrastructure that you have in your community. So the people that pick up the compost bins in your community, are they able to process the biodegradable products that you put in the composting? So you have to be careful about that. There are some biodegradable products that can be processed very easily, but some that are often marketed as green or compostable or some words like that are not. So these things are still being worked out both in industry and research facilities and among government agencies. But as a consumer, you just have to maybe spend a few more seconds just doing a smell test. This says it's biodegradable. Do I really think it's biodegradable? Maybe worth asking a question.
Wonderful advice. Definitely always asking questions is the best way to go. So as we're just kind of actually coming up to the end of today's program, time flies. It's great to see so many great questions and thoughts of how people can kind of reduce plastic and help remove plastic or prevent them from getting into our oceans. Is that, from Oceanwise Education, we're constantly working with new folks that are kind of thinking about getting into the field of scientific research. And do you have any advice for people that would like to become more active in this field?
I don't know if I'm smart enough to give advice. I would say if you're Oceanwise Education has some tremendous programs to introduce you to what are the kinds of challenges and where can you take action to have the most impact. Our goal is to have a clean ocean. So what are small things that we can do towards having that impact? So if you want to learn more about that, I think some of the Oceanwise Education programs would be fantastic. Yeah, and I guess there's always a need for people who understand science. Some of the questions were about food ingestion by different marine animals. So everything going from that up to chemistry and physics to help us solve some of these problems. So it's always useful for people with skills and training like that.
Wonderful. Well, yeah, there's lots of great opportunities. I'm just going to pop one of our plastic resource education kits into the chat here as well. And I think, asking great questions, as you said, being kind of critical thinking about some of the solutions that are being offered, being conscientious of, your choices as an individual is a great step to helping combat some of these issues. And it's wonderful to have people researching and looking into these things so that you can inform industry as well as all of us to inspire us to be better. So thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your work. And I definitely learned lots about FTIR that I didn't know before. And so it's always great to come away with some more of those thoughts and ideas. And so I'll encourage our audience to give you a big thank you in the chat. And I hope that they learned lots. We'd love to hear you share what some of your favorite things, some of your favorite takeaways from today's program was. So feel free to share that in the chat, or again, to share it on social media with the hashtag OceanWiseResearch. We'd love to see what your thoughts from today were. And I'm gonna quickly share my screen again for a couple of closing notes from today's program. Is that we would love for you to stay connected with us, to share your learning experiences. You can find us on Twitter at OceanWiseEDU or at Plastic Lab to find out what the latest is going on with their research. You can find out resources and other programs coming up by visiting our online Ocean at ocean.org/learn-online. And so hopefully you'll be joining us for either next week's program at 1 p.m. with Dr. Warner, all about tracking killer whales and their DNA, as well as tuning in for our next Live from the Wet Lab biologist talk, learning all about what we have coming up next week and for tomorrow, Friday's program. And as I said, we're here at the Vancouver Aquarium today, but I'm not in front of any of our galleries just because we have been conserving energy and powering off some of the lights out there. And so we'd love any kind of support that you want to send our way. Again, sharing how much you enjoy these programs is a great way to support us. You can also visit our www.vanaqua.cva/community, and I'll pop that link because it's a little bit of a mouthful into the chat as well. And you can find out all sorts of great ways, whether it's buying sustainable seafood chowder or visiting various local florists. The community has really come out with so many engaging ways to make a donation to support Vancouver Aquarium and OceanWise in these challenging times. And on that note, our next programs coming up is the Best of Growth Worlds tomorrow at 11 a.m. live from our wet lab. And you can find the link at our online Oceans page, and we'd love to see you there tomorrow. And so I'm gonna stop sharing my screen, pop that last link into the chat for you, and then we'll sign off and say goodbye until our next program.
Thank you, everyone. Really love the questions.
They were absolutely great questions. It was so good to hear all the great questions and great kind of moments of inspiration and connection that people had to this topic today. So there you go. There's that link for you. And we'll give everybody a wave and sign off until next time. Thank you.